Okay. So, I'm Arje Nachman, and I manage a portfolio titled Electromagnetics. And the brief description of the portfolio is the interrogation, modeling and simulation, of linear and nonlinear Maxwell's equations. And the sub-areas in the portfolio, as they have been for a while, are the four you see there. Theoretical nonlinear optics, wave propagation through complex media, fundamentals of antenna design and operation, fundamentals of effects of electromagnetic exposure on circuitry. So the second and third have some stuff in common, which I'll mention in a few slides. The fourth one is kind of a boutique effort. It concerns itself with what sort of mischief can you do on circuitry, or how do you avoid having other people do mischief on your circuitry. So that's a combination of how does electromagnetic waves get into enclosures, whether the enclosure is into a guidance part of an upcoming missile, or whether the enclosure is your laptop. That's a classical electromagnetics problem. It's a wave propagation. In fact, it's kind of a wave propagation through complex media, because those enclosures are generally messy, and one is slightly different than the next. Because, but the other half of the challenge is because everybody's circuitry now has transistors and other nonlinear pieces. Electromagnetic effects can produce chaos. And so the question is, when can that happen? Or how do you avoid that happening? As I said, it's a boutique effort, and it's something that was started by me and our previous chief scientist, Tom Hussey. Our new chief scientist, Chuck Matson, has encouraged all of us to sort of rethink how we want to present our spring reviews. And what I did, instead of going through it as literally by those four sub-areas, I thought I would split it up into a way that the way I actually think about it, which is linear Maxwell's equations and nonlinear Maxwell's equations. And indeed, each of those has its own annual contractors meeting, separately, months apart. And it's because the terminology and the mathematics and some of the notions that appear in nonlinear Maxwell's equations are not particularly, the people who do linear Maxwell's equations are not particularly conversant with the people who do nonlinear Maxwell's equations, and vice versa. So this might be a good way, this opportunity from Dr. Matson might be a good way for me to re-discuss my portfolio. So the linear Maxwell's equations have two really dominant features. One of them is the behavior, temporal and spatial dispersion aspects of metamaterials. And I've gotten into the habit now of using the word metamaterials canonically. This is anything that has an unusual or beguiling or whatever characteristic. Of course, it's man-made. I now call metamaterials, although the term first came up when people realized that they could produce, by making a composite, materials that effectively, at least in a narrow band range, in a limited frequency range, they could produce materials that effectively had behaved as if they're the two key parameters in Maxwell's equations, permittivity and permeability, were one or the other or both negative. So the term came up. But in fact, I think that making these metamaterials, or making these sorts of beguiling or interesting materials, which had those photonic band gap materials, which I lump now into metamaterials, and photonic bandgap materials is nothing but a clever geometric juxtaposition of basic components. Could be silicon and air, when you're finished making such a thing, layers of alternating layers of those sorts of things, you have a material that doesn't allow transmission in a gap, in a reasonably generous region of the frequency domain. That's why it's called a photonic band gap media. And I myself got into this business prior to, I didn't fund photonic band gap material, that was Yablonowicz and Joannopoulos, but some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I funded work at the University of California in Irvine, where two clever scientists conceived of also a layering of slabs. They had 3 slabs which they periodically repeated. The first 2 were both dielectrics. They were also polarized, and they required that the 2 regions were misaligned in polarization, but not by 90 degrees. And the 3rd layer was magnetic, and they were able to show that in the microwave regime, you can get such a periodic media to have basically a zero in the dispersion plane, where omega versus k, that not only is omega by decay 0, but so is the second derivative. So this is an instance when you also have slow light, except it's in the microwave regime and has nothing to do with quantum mechanics. It's a completely classical thing. Later on, Lockheed Martin started designing a kind of antennas using these kind of ideas. But it was an interesting exploitation of flow K theory, which is how you solve those equations in that 3-layer medium. Subsequently, one of the 2 people at Irvine who was on soft money, I was able to get him hired, or I agitated in behalf of his being hired at the Sensors Directorate at Wright-Patterson. He's there now. I'm going to talk about something he did lately, and moreover, I'm also going to remember to mention that variance of what he did is an important part of a Muri that I'll mention in a few slides. The second part of this let's see, of this linear thing is wave propagation through random and turbulent media, and that's natural media. The Air Force is challenged and stressed by the business of communicating through or imaging through or what have you, all kinds of things that nature does to us. Not only is the atmosphere turbulent, as Kent Miller mentioned, but other media such as foliage, or clouds, soil, if you want to find stuff beneath the soil. Those are all random, they're dispersive, and the Air Force would be well served if we knew more about them than we do now. And in a few slides I'll talk about ways of approaching that is somewhat at variance, or more modern than the 70-year-old Monte Carlo, which is perfectly good but needs revisiting. Now, the nonlinear Maxwell's equations, on the one hand, one of the key scientific areas, and which you'll see later on has a Muri involved in it, is the fundamental modeling and simulation research which addresses concerns with femtosecond filament arrangements and plasma channel characteristics. So you heard about that from Rick Pera. Rick and I are co-POs of a Muri, which I started, in fact, in a few slides I'll mention again, that concerns itself with just that problem. The business of these femtosecond filament arrangements goes back to the mid-90s, when Europe, which was possessed of something they built called a Terramobile, started emitting 50 femtoseconds, thereabout, pulses that came out of the laser in the IR range. Of course, with higher harmonic generation, as they propagated, they produced higher frequencies. But those pulses propagated, as the Europeans claimed, for kilometers with very little diffraction, which meant that the air was a nonlinear medium, which allows me to mention something I've said once in a while when I could. There's no such thing as a quote-unquote nonlinear medium. Every medium can be nonlinear if you push it hard enough. If the electromagnetic field that's in the medium is intense enough, nonlinearity is important enough that you can't neglect it. And that's exactly what's going on there. That's why these things do what they do. And that pulse had lots of little filaments in it, which is what I mentioned there with the filament arrangements. And one of the things that MURI was supposed to look at is to see if we can exploit the arrangements to do communications, and evidently we can. But it was Dr. Milchberg at Maryland who has a very good progress in answering that question. And the second paragraph there is advances in modeling and simulation of fiber and solid-state lasers. And I mentioned here I have a new BRI which finally got started on non-equilibrium carrier distributions to guide the development of compact high-energy systems. So in this case, the question is the modeling and simulation involves nonlinear partial differential equations. The interesting thing is that the non-equilibrium carrier distribution is really sort of inspired by some of the questions that came from the femtosecond filament arrangements, and Rick Parra mentioned that too, that electrons are shot out of, or stripped from air molecules, oxygen and nitrogen, and you'd like to know what goes on with them, and it turns out that questions like that can occur in solid-state lasers, and the BRI that John Gongluski and I have, he's back there, seeks to look into that and to see whether we can exploit situations where the carrier distribution is not allowed to return to Fermi-Dirac equilibrium. So we were asked to contemplate Air Force importance. Well, clearly, if we can get a handle, a real handle, as opposed to phenomenological handle on imaging through challenging media like foliage or turbulence or what have you, the Air Force is going to be able to image, communicate, and engage under non-ideal conditions. Clouds over battlefields are there about 60% of the time. So, and during the Serbian War, President Clinton ran. Whoever it was we were fighting pulled all their important assets into an old growth forest, and we couldn't see any of it. We never actually destroyed any of their stuff. And the second bullet is what I mentioned earlier, or alluded to, that there is a connection between metamaterials and the business I have on antenna design and operation, that it's almost certain going to be the case that if you want to make small and highly effective antennas for the UAV and satellite fleets that we're more and more dependent on, metamaterials are going to be at the heart of that. They allow us to do surprising things, and in some instances may allow us to do that in a very small volume. Another, as several people mentioned, how included that fiber lasers, semiconductor lasers can do infrared countermeasures. And the last one I hadn't mentioned before, routing optical signals aboard a platform. I also have a little effort in that. There are crystals, I guess I could call them nonlinear crystals, where if you shine a distribution of lasers at them, you will produce regions where the index of refraction in the crystal is different than it is in the bulk of the crystal. So you can get, so the crystal starts looking like almost like a dice. If it's a cubic, it's got patterns in it, and you can use those patterns to reflect, scatter various signals and reroute them. And not only that, but in principle, these when you shut that laser pattern off and turn a different one on, you can reconfigure that rerouter on the fly, on the board of the airplane. You don't have to do it. You don't have to fly back to base to do that. So What is my investment strategy? I thought a long time about that, and I decided I didn't want to write down platitudes about funding smart people, or this or that. I thought I'd really get into the weeds and give you an idea what it is that the modern mathematical methods that I'm interested in encouraging, and which should be able to make a big impact on all the stuff that I fund. So I have 9 of them. Modern computational electromagnetics. Computational electromagnetics is still a living area. There's plenty of stuff to do, making not only faster codes, but you may want to make sure that you don't get the wrong answer quickly. So they're also accurate codes. You want to make sure that you have error estimates that are rigorous, provable. Stochastic partial differential equation. That's an area, for example, in turbulence where the index of refraction is not a deterministic function of time and space. That means that that's an example of a stochastic partial differential equation. We used to think about doing that by taking realizations of indexes of refraction, and I hasten to tell you that messy pictures and randomness are not the same thing. Anything you put into a computer, for example, index of refraction, you have to put it in deterministically. You have to tell it what it is, or else you can't run it in the computer. So every realization of a random process is deterministic. So you can solve those equations many times, but there's better ways to do that, and there's work on stochastic partial differential equations that are first principles, and I'm interested in pursuing that. Modern homogenization theory, I'm going to show you a little bit of that in some slides later, but that's basically asks you, can you get an effective idea of what of a medium? Sometimes you can, other times that's a bad idea. The one-way slab that I mentioned for a microwave propagation, you couldn't homogenize it. If you did, you wouldn't have an omega versus k, which is as complicated as I said. You'd have a simplistic one. That would be the wrong answer. Modern inverse scattering theory, I actually mentioned that last year. It's not what you think, and it's certainly not by solving the forward problem thousands of times and figuring out which answer has the closest approximation to the data you've collected. There's other ways of doing it, and outright solving the inverse scattering problems, and I encourage people to do things like that. Fourier integral operator theory, well, that comes up in synthetic aperture radar. If you had a synthetic aperture radar that was moving along and possibly in a straight path, and it was trying to image targets on a flat Earth, et cetera, it turns out that the solution, finding what the target is, you can write the solution to that as an integral equation with a kernel. You have to invert that, of course, to get the answer for where the target is. But if we have a flat Earth and a simple path and other things that are nice, then that integral equation is, in fact, a Fourier transform. And it can be easily solved. But when the Earth is topologically complicated, hills and valleys, when it has clutter in it, when the UAV or whatever is moving in a non-trivial path, which turns out to actually be a good idea, then that integral equation which you have is actually called a Fourier integral operator. And if you want to use synthetic aperture radar in a real setting as opposed to an academic setting, you have to look into Fourier integral operator theory, and I support that. Nonlinear partial differential equations come up in nonlinear optics. They used to be that the workhorse was the nonlinear Schrodinger equation. It's gotten worse and worse as we understand more and more about things. The MIRI for these femtosecond pulses does not use the nonlinear Schrodinger equation. But you do have to confront nonlinear partial differential equations as they come. Then Maxwell-Bloch semiconductor theory is basically a system of equations which combines electromagnetics and carrier dynamics, which is that's where it's sort of a way of doing both first principles dynamics of electrons and holes and the electromagnetic field they create. Differential delay equations is sometimes the case. You cannot ignore the fact that when lasers, for example, are running around and around inside of a cavity, that there's a delay in what comes around. And you don't want to ignore that. Then you have a differential delay equation. You cannot imagine that's instantaneous any longer. And that has its own challenges. And PT theory, that comes up in a MURI that I think is on the next page or so. That's called parity time theory, and the question is whether you can exploit this interesting area in the area of electromagnetics, because it came up originally in quantum mechanics, and I spoke about that 2 years ago. The rest of my investment strategy is in the next 4 bullets. I certainly advocate MURIs and BRI topics. I support extramural, intramural efforts. I have 10 lab tests, which I have a slide on. I interact with the agencies that I indicate there, and I do leverage STTRs. I have one which we're reading now, and one which is on the out in the streets, and one's in the SIBR, the other one's an STTR. So the 3 MURIs in my program. Ultra-short laser pulses, that's at the University of Arizona. It started its 4th year in October, although it didn't get its money until about a week ago. High power, low loss artificial materials for transformational electromagnetics, which I co-manage with John Lugensland. Had its 1st year review here in town in October. That is an instance where there is an effort to exploit a certain kind of version of that one-way slab stuff in terms of magnetics, whether these sort of metamaterials can be married to high-power microwave sources. I don't know if John's going to actually get it. Oh, you are? Good. Well, then I don't have to. And photonic synthetic matter is something I do with Charles Lee, and as I said, that emphasizes PT symmetry. Recently started, which I guess is either October or November, but that's just going. So here's a list of my lab tasks, and I only want to point out a couple of things. This top one, as you can see, electromagnetic materials and antennas, which emphasizes what I said earlier, that those two are closely connected. The second one, Ilya Vitsevsky, he's the one whose work who invented back at Irvine the one-way slabs, and he's the one who I'm going to talk about later. I have a star team. Nick Usacek, where is he? There he is, which started in FY13. And the only other point I wanted to make about this is that there are 4 of these lab tests are nonlinear optics, 5 of them are linear electromagnetics, and 1 of them, which is Tim Clark, is that hybrid where it's electromagnetic effects on circuitry. So I have, okay. I do connect with other organizations. I've known Mike Schlesinger for years. Not only am I on 2 of his MURI panels, he recently, because he's the chair of the physics NSSEFF panel, he dragged me into that too, so I'm working with him on that. I have a sort of an interaction with Mark Spector. I certainly love the MURI he has on negative index media. And John Lugensland and I recently, a few weeks ago, were invited to sit on the formal review panel for his 6.1/6.2 counter-directed energy weapons program. So we did that. Rich Hammond at ARO has also an ultra-short laser pulse propagation MURI. It's a year younger than mine. Different stuff that's emphasized, and so we served on each other's panel. And it's important for me to point out that I have a growing collaboration with Joe Myers. Not only did I sit on his panel for multi-scale modeling MURI, but in a way that I'm going to get into, I had something to do with this computational EM STTR. I talked with Deb Palmer and John Gorman at DARPA. John Gorman came this past January to my linear electromagnetics contractors meeting, and wound up encouraging some of the people there to send him a proposal to do some real things. And I have an interesting, because I have the tickets, I have an interesting relationship with the NRO. Okay, so let me get into topic details. And so let me just get into the significant accomplishments. I have 3 of them. So let me talk about them one after the next. Pat Roach grabbed this slide and showed it. This is something that Dan Siebenpiper is doing. And by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, metamaterials includes, at least for me and a lot of other people, meta surfaces. They're not all bulk metamaterials. Sometimes you can do surfaces. And Dan Siebenpiper originally pitched this thing to me with the idea of if he could cover the tail, which is green, there is not a composite. It's layered. He glues things on it. And the point of gluing things on it, which I'll show you in a minute, is to make the tail less of a nuisance to this AWACS. And as those 2 little Pac-Man and the one that's got its mouth closed, the upper one is what happens if right now. The tail you have to basically turn off the radars that sweeps past the tail, otherwise it screws up things because it scatters. But if Dan Siebenpiper's ideas could come to fruition, then his ideas is how to reroute radar waves around that tail. The story, as Pat Roach told you, appeared back in the summer as a monthly activity report. As soon as, and by the way, this work, Dan Siebenpiper's grant is co-funded with Dave Stargell. As soon as I sent it in, I got back a query from Dayton asking how fast could the tail be done. I said, no time soon. And in fact, the PI had barely figured out how to do some simple proof of concept in his lab on much higher frequencies, because in a lab you need a much smaller source. They generate higher frequencies, so the AWACS is in a few hundreds of megahertz, and what he's doing is in the gigahertz. So, but it suggested that another instantiation of this idea was what you see here, that maybe you can have a high power transmitter which will produce some surface waves, and you want to avoid, if you can, a sensitive receiver, and his ideas will do that. And what he does is what you see above there. This is sort of notional. He can do these curved coupons. They're metal, underneath them is some kind of dielectric, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, how do you design these coupons so that it gets you the effect that you want? And designing them is a modeling and simulation. You can't do this by accident or keep fooling around. So this is Siebenpiper's stuff, and it's very interesting, as I said. Now here's what I have is work by Art Nachman, Andrea Alou, and Dr. Silverina, who's in Coimbra, which is in Italy. Rigorous homogenization of materials and metamaterials. And those 3 we're looking at basically what you see there, an array of inclusions, little metallic spheres, for example. And although it's true that all materials are spatially dispersive, if your frequencies are really, really high enough, ultraviolet or even higher, in general, things like air are continua. And the question, and you can see here what's important is that Art what did I just bump into? Art and the other 2 argue that Maxwell's equation should be written this way instead of the other way around, where mu sits there. And the reason is that while it's irrelevant for air and water and a lot of other continuum where mu sits, whether it's mu that sits in front of H or mu inverse sits in front of B, it's not irrelevant when you get into metamaterials. That's because epsilon and mu for things like air or water or copper, what have you, are only at most functions of frequency, and so they're causal. But when you're doing metamaterials, you must worry about epsilon and mu being not only functions of frequency, but functions of the spatial dimensions. Because if you don't, then mu can turn out to be non-causal, and if you do it right, 1 over mu is causal. That's an astounding result. It's going to, I guess, annoy the electrical engineering community, or at least that part of the electrical engineering community that looks at metamaterials that are made of inclusions. Those people who worry about radar and air aren't going to care about this at all. But it's quite a thing to generalize something Landau and Lifshitz did, and Art did this. Art and Andrea and Dr. Silverino did this rigorously. It's in several very long papers, and so you have to worry in the business of metamaterials. If you want to do it correctly, you have to worry about spatial dispersion, and you have to worry about it rigorously. You're going to get the wrong answer. Okay, let's see. I want to go through this quickly. When you do wave propagation numerically, for example, a pulse approaching an airplane, you have to do that problem in a closed region. The computer cannot do an infinite region, simply can't. There's no way of doing it. So you have to close off the region, and when you close off the region, if you do nothing, the waves will bounce back and give you the wrong answer, because the real airplane in the sky, every wave that scatters off it goes off to infinity, or as close to infinity as we can get here on Earth. And if you don't do that, you're going to get the wrong answer real quickly. So people realized that, even back in the 60s, and they tried to figure out artificial boundary conditions that would try to make waves that were about to enter back into the region to get rid of them. That didn't work real well, although they still use those sorts of things. Sometimes it takes a little while because there's surface currents on that artificial boundary. They're artificial currents, but nevertheless, it all goes to hell, and people just keep doing more and more work to accomplish what they really want, which is to get rid of these things. So Dr. Tsinkoff looked at something that I knew about as a graduate student, which is that in 3 dimensions, pulses that have an arrival time also have a departure time, the back of the pulse. That doesn't happen in even dimensional spaces, but it does happen in odd dimensional spaces. And he has figured out a way of marrying that to all the other ways that people do on the artificial boundary. You can just, and when you do it, all you have to know is where the aft fronts are. And once you do it his way, the waves that would have come back out are killed off, and they're killed off forever. And it doesn't matter which of anybody else's boundary conditions you marry it to, you win. So the interesting thing is here, let me see. Is that Joe Myers, rather than me, was reading Tsinkoff's work. I had funded it and never thought much about it, because I thought kind of clever. He made up an STTR topic on it. And as you know, STTR topics require references at the bottom. Dr. Tsinkoff's papers were referenced. And he is running with this. Of course, not surprisingly, a company reached out to Tsinkoff as their university sub-partner. And so this is going to be a transition. This is going to be something that will give people a methodology for doing these things really accurately. Last, let me go into the significant accomplishments, since I don't have much time. This is Dr. Ilya Vitebsky, who, as I said, used to be at Irvine, now is at RY, and Dr. Kotos, who's in the physics department at Wesley University. They have what's called a reflective optical limiter. For many years, I knew about efforts in the materials directorate to design some version of sunglasses which darken when they put in front of when they're exposed to very high intensity signals, so they can protect a sensor behind them. And that never worked. I funded research into wave propagation through those kind of things, but they never found anything that worked. Dr. Vitebsky has gotten a better idea. Instead of trying to get something that darkens, he's got this very interesting idea, and it works as follows. If this blue layer in the middle wasn't there, this alternating pink and white layers are a photonic band gap medium. And I guess they're made out of silicon dioxide and aluminum dioxide. Photonic band gap medium means, let me just jump back and forth, that in a frequency range, all by itself without the blue layer, there's zero transmission over a region in the frequency space. And so it disallows propagation. If you put any kind of defect into a photonic band gap medium, and for the moment this blue layer is a defect, then what you get is you can get propagation inside of that gap. And this propagation can be arranged, if you do it correctly, to be in the frequency that the sensor behind it wants, whether it's microwave, light, this, that, the other. So that's interesting. But now the real question is, what happens if somebody's trying to really screw around with you and send a very high intensity light toward this thing? This thing works by, instead of absorbing the light, which might destroy it, it certainly will heat it up, this thing reflects the light when it gets high enough intensity. This is a nonlinear layer, as it says down there, with an epsilon that moves as e squared. And the full composite doesn't absorb high-level radiation. It reflects it at arbitrary angles, and as you can see here, I keep doing that. This thing is an interesting feature of what you call the red curve is the transmission. So at very low intensities, 10 to the 9/10, the slab transmits, and as the intensity increases, it doesn't. Similarly, for very low intensities, there's very little reflection, 10 to the 9/4, but high reflection at high intensity. And this works passively. That blue layer there simply does that. Of course, if you really get a high enough laser intensity, it'll destroy everything. But in some reasonable area, this thing does what the materials directorate wants it to do. And they are, in fact, I'm hoping, promise to pursue this and test this out, probably a lot later than now, to see if this is the answer to their question for protecting pilots' eyes, protecting other kind of sensors. It's a very interesting marriage of nonlinear phenomena and photonic band gap reasoning, in other words, the metamaterials. Okay, so I'm done? No, I got 2 minutes?
No, I need to take questions. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Great. So I can't see.
So Dr.
Right.
Just one announcement. Dr. Bob Herklotz will not be presenting this afternoon to the public. So we're moving the talks after him up to fill those slots, and because there's only 4 talks, we're getting rid of the afternoon break. So after lunch, coming back at 1:35, and we'll have 4 talks to